Okay, so here we are. We're going to start talking about the seller side of the transaction. We start with the agreement of sale. Now, we saw and we went through the agreement of sale as if you were explaining it to your buyer. A lot of the things that we went through with the buyer side kind of apply to the seller, but I'm going to be a little more objective about what the seller side looks like. Because remember, I'm showing you this as in the way that how are you going to explain to your client, whether it be buyer or seller, the contract. So you already know the name of the parties, the address, and the information and why do we need their mailing address, the property, municipality, zip code, school district, county, tax ID. Remember, 2 parcels, even if it's a house and a lot, need to be named on the tax ID section of the agreement with the proper tax IDs if they're separate. Now let's talk about the seller's relationship with the PA licensed broker. It's pretty much almost the same. Broker company, license, address, phone number, and then you gotta state who the listing agent is, their information, and if they are a dual agent or not and a designated agent. If the seller side of the transaction is a transaction licensee, but you will not know unless you're handling both sides of the transaction. If you're handling both sides of the transaction, you'll know what to choose. Are you representing the buyer and just being a transaction licensee for the seller? Or are you representing the seller and are you just being a transaction licensee for the buyer? That can happen and it's okay. Dual agency, we all remember what dual agency is. We're fine with that. Then the agreement of sale, you tell your client, this is what their offer is, this is the deposit that they're giving, and you know who is going to hold the deposit. You don't really have to tell your seller who's holding the deposit, but it's good to let them know. Here you will show them what the sellers assist, if there is any, the buyer is requesting. Settlement date is a very, very important date. You got to let them know. You got to explain to them how the real estate taxes and all those things are being prorated, which I'm going to show you in the seller's estimated closing cost statement. And here you explain to the seller if the buyer, sometimes some buyers request that the seller pay all the transfer taxes. So if that happens, this is where you put it, okay? Or if your seller is saying, no, I'm not paying transfer taxes, that has to fall on the buyer, you will put it here saying that the buyer is responsible to pay all the transfer taxes. Then you got to tell your seller, your house must be delivered, broom swept and empty. Okay? It doesn't have to be professionally cleaned, but you got to let your seller know because some sellers slack in getting the house empty before settlement. So you got to make sure you make it clear to them unless the buyer wants some furniture that the seller is willing to sell or to give for free. If that's the case, make sure you do an addendum where whatever the seller is leaving is stated in that addendum and the buyer and the seller sign, because you don't want that buyer in the beginning say, yeah, I want the living room set. And then at settlement say, no, I don't want the living room set. It's crappy. So now your seller has to get rid of it at the last minute because the buyer didn't want it. So unless there is something in writing, your seller is on the line. So make sure you always put this in writing. Tenant occupied property addendum, you already know when you need it. If you're selling an investment property for a client and their property is rented, you got to make sure you get this form. Date and time is of the essence. All the dates have to be met. All the dates have to be respected. All changes to this agreement should be initialed and dated. Remember that, okay? Zoning, remember what we know about zoning. If it's not put on here, unless it's single family, it can cancel the contract. So make sure that when you review this contract with your client, there is a zoning designation put on by the buyer's agent. Because if single family, it's okay. But if a duplex, multifamily, or mixed use, and they don't put it here, the buyer can cancel your seller's contract at any time. The same thing here. What does the buyer want the seller to leave? So you got to make sure you make that clear to your seller, because if you don't, and this buyer wants the front load washer and dryer, and you didn't tell that to your client when they took the offer, and the buyer wants it and the seller doesn't want to give it, but now your seller signed on here, but you didn't explain it to him, you are at fault. So be careful, okay? The same thing about buyer's financing. You explain to your client the type of financing, how much they're financing. Are they financing 100%, 95%, all of that. You got to explain to your client what kind of financing the buyer is offering to acquire the property through. If it's an FHA or VA deal, you got to tell your client, because this is a government-backed loan, FHA or VA, and if the appraisal doesn't come in value, they can't just walk away. They will if they want to. So you got to make sure your seller knows this. And then to explain to them about the 203K, if it's an FHA 203K loan. Explain to them about that the buyer has the right to get a home inspection. And then tell your seller that if they're buying the property, are they buying it cash or with a mortgage? And if they're getting with a mortgage, that you offer that sale is contingent upon them getting the mortgage. Remember, 90% of the transactions in the U.S. are financed. But if you don't explain to your client what financing means, what it entails, your client is not going to know unless they're in finance. And most people are not in finance. So it's your job to explain to your seller, hey, they're getting a mortgage, but if the mortgage doesn't get approved, they can cancel the deal. But you also got to explain to them that there are certain things, criteria and conditions that they have to meet. It's not like you just walk away, that the loan has to actually be denied. And there needs to be a denial letter signed by an underwriter. So if the buyer's agent calls you as a listing agent and says, oh, I'm sorry, my client's loan got denied. Okay, send me a denial letter signed by an underwriter. And then I want to see why the loan was denied. Why do you want to see why the loan is denied? Because you want to see and go back to the BFI and see, was the loan denied because they acquired debt while in the transaction? Was the loan denied because they don't have enough money to close, but in the BFI they say that they have enough money to close? Did the loan get denied because the appraisal didn't come in value? Why did the loan get denied? You want to know that because you're representing the seller, and you got to push this as far as you can to make sure you get your seller to not lose everything if the deal falls through. There's a deposit for a reason. So you want to make sure that this deal didn't fall through because the buyer's agent slacked or didn't do their job, or maybe the buyer just went ahead and while he was in their agreement, he went and got a new car. You're not supposed to. So make sure you explain to your seller how the mortgage contingency works. Make sure, if you can, get a nice range here, okay? Get a nice range here for the rate. Remember? Let's say they're pre-approved for a 5.5% rate. Make sure they put from 5 to 6. That way you get a range of, in case rates go up, that the buyer has to buy the property. If it's a one mortgage or is it two mortgages, make sure everything is on here. Match the pre-approval with this information. Remember, they must order the appraisal within 7 days. They need to do the loan application and order the appraisal. So keep that in mind. We already reviewed this in the buyer's end of the transaction. And again, we have the clauses here. If the seller will not make the required repairs that the appraisal requires, or if the seller fails to respond within the stated time, buyer will, within 5 days, notify the seller. So make sure that you know these clauses, because now you're on the other side of the coin. So if the buyer doesn't want to move on with the transaction and they don't fulfill these days, they're in default. So now you're at an advantage, okay? Change in buyer's financial status. We already went on that. Water, sewer. They mark it, make sure it matches with what the actual house has. About these sewage systems, you already know about that. It really most of the time doesn't apply. Land use restriction, unless it's a farm or something really specific, it does not really apply. Explain it to your client if it does apply. Real estate seller disclosure law, you should really go over this with your client, because at the end of the day, your client is the one who is filling this out. Your client should fill the seller's disclosure out, and they should know the duties about it, okay? About assessments. Maybe they knew before selling the property they were going to be assessed and they're going to get whacked with real estate taxes. You got to disclose that, okay? Any special assessments, your client has to disclose it, and you got to make sure they disclose it here in the contract, unless it is on the seller's disclosure statement. The Internet of Things. Explain to your client what items they need to leave that are connected to the house. Let's say a smart thermostat, the smart doorbell. Those things, if they're attached to the house, they need to stay. So tell them and explain to your clients that they need to reset the passwords and erase all the information from those devices before moving out of the house. Okay? Waiver of contingencies is the same thing. How does this work when the buyer does not want to get a home inspection, when they want to buy the property as is? Okay? This is for the buyer. So, but you still got to explain to your client how the home inspections work. How are the home inspections going to happen? How many days does the buyer have to do the home inspections? What is our responsibility as a listing agent and as the seller to make sure that the water, the sewer, the gas, the electric, all utilities are working and available for the home inspection? Because if you don't explain this to your client and your client doesn't have water or electric or gas connected, then the buyer cannot do the home inspection. Now you, the seller, are responsible. The seller is responsible. So you got to make sure you tell your client from the seller end that they got to make sure they make the house available for the inspection, and also that they are obliged to provide utilities and to be on. And then explain to them how the process works. The home inspection happens. How long they have to do to give us a report? Do we have to do all the repairs? It's a negotiation, so you got to explain to your seller how the condition and the contingency works. Okay. Then we go into environmental inspections only if it applies. Exterior, asbestos, environmental hazards, wetlands, mold and fungi, any other stuff. Explain to them the 10 days or 15 days or however days they want. You can also counter offer. If the buyer's agent makes an offer and they put 20 days for home inspections or for inspections, you can say, no, we're not okay with that. We want 10 days. So you cross it off, you mark 10 days, and you have your seller initial. That's a counter offer. Then you got to explain to your seller. This buyer may be, after inspection, this buyer may just be okay with the house. They may just ask us to do some repairs, or they may not want the house. You got to make it clear to the seller that the buyer can walk away for any reason after the home inspection within the contingency period. So your seller should be prepared for this. At least you need to make sure they know it, okay? Title, explain to them that if not able to deliver, explain to them that their buyer is going to get a title report done on the property because the mortgage company needs the title to be insured, but also tell them that if the property has any issues legally and that will prevent the seller from selling, then the seller is responsible for the title search cost and the inspection cost to the buyer. Why? Because it's not the fault of the buyer that the seller could not deliver a clear title, right? So you got to make sure you do that on paragraph 14. If you know that your seller has any mineral rights that had been sold, you got to make sure that you put it on here. The same thing about notices, assessment, and municipal requirements. If your seller has received any notice from the township or the city as to the property, you got to make sure they disclose it. If it's a condominium, you got to let them know how it works, that you guys need to order a resale certificate from the condominium association, and they need to follow up on that. Okay? We're talking about real estate taxes and assessed value, maintenance and risk of loss. Make your client aware, your seller, that although they have signed an agreement of sale to sell the property, they are still responsible to keep up with the house. And when they leave the house, they cannot take the toilet. Okay? I had a situation years ago where the house went under agreement, and the family had a party on this vacant home, and the people in the party peed on the walls before settlement. So when the buyer went to do a walkthrough, the house stunk because they thought they didn't have to worry about the house anymore because it was sold. Well, guess what? Settlement didn't happen. It had to be pushed 2 weeks, and the seller had to go back in, clean up, and paint the place and make it, how it was before the party and when the buyer. Remember, maintenance and risk of loss goes back to a very, very basic principle, which is why you have to tell your seller and your buyer. You're supposed to keep the house in the same condition that it was the moment the offer was made until the day of settlement, unless normal wear and tear happens. And again, if the seller doesn't take care of the property and something goes wrong, the buyer is not obligated to buy the house. Then we go back to the same 3 options that I explained to you earlier. They can take it as is, they can negotiate with the seller to repair or give a credit, or they can just walk away. But in that case, they need to give a written notice to the seller within the specified time. Home warranties, I would suggest you advise the seller to give a home warranty when they sell a house, because if there is a problem after settlement, for $600, you're not going to hear from this buyer. So it's a smart thing to offer your sellers as an option. Recording, tell your seller that the agreement of sale is not going to be recorded, but the deed will be when the sale happens. Tell your seller that this contract cannot be assigned unless the buyer and the seller approve it. Tell him that we're in Pennsylvania and the laws and everything that happens with this deal will be managed and handled in Pennsylvania. Tell them if they're a foreign investor, the title company must hold a percentage of the sale, which is 15%, right? The Megan's Law doesn't really apply. Representations, tell them that they're telling the truth to the best of their knowledge, and that you, as their listing agent or the seller's agent, you're going to do the best to represent them, and that all communication needs to be done through you with the other side. Explain to them, this is highly, highly, highly important. Explain to them how this paragraph 26 works. Default, termination, and return of deposits. I'm going to go over it one more time. When a transaction takes place and there is an escrow being held by the listing agent or whomever, that money cannot be released unless 3 things happen. There is a settlement, that means everyone's happy, we all go into settlement, the broker releases the money, it goes to the title company, the buyer gets a credit for it, everything's fine. 2, there is a mutual written agreement saying who gets what money. Let's say it's $10,000 and they agree that the buyer is going to keep 5 and the seller is going to keep 5, that's fine. If I, as a broker, get a letter, an agreement of sale release stating that that's the case, I'll release 5 and 5. But if there is no mutual agreement, it can only be released through court. Now, there is a clause which I explained to you guys about right here, paragraph C. Okay? Which states that if there is no mutual agreement between the buyer and the seller as to who gets the money, and there is no legal dispute or mediation by anybody, and the seller is not filing a lawsuit or against the buyer, and also the buyer can and must request the money to be released back to him in writing. The thing here is, this broker has to release it within 30 days, but this clause applies here. Remember I told you the standard day here is 180? I want to zoom in because this is highly, highly important. So 180 days, but because now you're being trained properly, what you're going to do is you're going to put 1 here. 1 day. Always put 1 day. Why? Because if you remember, Buyer and seller agree that if there is a dispute over the entitlement to deposit monies that is unresolved, 1 day after the settlement date is stated in paragraph 4A. So it says, buyer and seller agree that if there is a dispute over the entitlement to deposit monies that is unresolved, 1 day after the settlement date is stated in paragraph 4A. So February 28th. So 1 day, that means the 1st of March. Or any written extension thereof. So if the settlement was extended, let's say till March 15th, then 1 day it will be March 16th if there is an extension. Or following the termination of the agreement, whichever is earlier, then the broker holding the deposit monies will, within 30 days of receipt of buyer's written request. So what you need to do, what the buyer's agent needs to do is they need to send you as the listing agent a written request saying that the buyer requests the money to be released to them. If they don't do that, you don't have the listing broker doesn't have to release any money. But if they do it, then you gotta wait 30 days and release the money. Okay? And then you gotta explain to your seller that the sellers are usually really upset when the deal falls through. And they want to sue everyone. And they want to get as much money as they can. But you got to explain to your seller, because if the buyer's agent check this box, then tell your seller that if the deal falls through, Mr. Seller, you cannot go after the buyer for any more than the deposit. Okay? And then you can tell your seller that if this buyer fails to make any additional payments or furnish false incomplete information or violates or fail to fulfill the contract, they can try to keep that money. So what is the recourse to the seller if the buyer defaults? Is the deposit. Now, if they don't mark this box, then the seller can go after the buyer for wages, liquidated damages, a lot of things. So it depends on what happens here. Mediation, you got to tell your seller, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, if the deal falls through or there's a problem, we cannot just go ahead and sue everyone. We have to go through mediation first. If mediation doesn't help or work, we can go and do and file a suit against these people. Release, you got to explain to your seller that when the deal dies or cancels, this clause applies, which states that everyone is released from any and all responsibility in the transaction. Brokers, agents, inspectors, banks, everyone. You can also explain to the seller about the real estate recovery fund, saying that if a person has been defrauded by a licensed real estate agent and that person obtains a judgment against that professional, the real estate recovery fund will pay the money to that person, in this case, the seller. Tell them about the communication. You are the point of contact between the seller and the buyer's agent and the buyer. So tell your seller. Some sellers like to call other people like the buyer, so we've got to make sure that your seller knows that it's through you. And then if there are any other addendums, you got to explain it to your seller and how it works. And in the event that the buyer didn't have the seller disclosure available when they made the offer and the clause is here, you got to explain to your seller that you need to provide the seller's disclosure and they have 7 days to approve it or reject it. So technically the deal is not consummated until the buyer reviews that seller's disclosure if it was not provided initially. And then you have your seller signed on line 819 and dated, and then if you don't have any changes, that should consummate, that should make the agreement executed, and then the days will start counting as of that date. Okay, this is it for the seller's side of the agreement of sale and part of the seller's package when you get an offer.